My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and I have now seen the Tolkien movie 2019 by Dome Karukoski. Hope I'm pronouncing his name right. Sorry if I'm not. I watched it yesterday, which was May the 11th, and so now I'm giving my review. Before I get started, I do want to make a few disclaimers. This is the first time I've really seen a movie in theaters in a long time because I've got kids, and that makes it a little bit difficult. So if I liked it more than I should have, that may have had something to do with it. Also, the only biography of Tolkien I've ever read is the one by Humphrey Carpenter. So to the extent that I'm going to talk about the accuracy of the treatment of the events in Tolkien's life, I'm basing it on the information I have from Humphrey Carpenter and not much else. So there may be some things that I just don't know. Uh, Also, this isn't particularly relevant, but this is also the first movie I've ever actually seen in theaters by myself, so that was an interesting experience. But it was nice because I went to a really early screening and there were only about 5 people in the room. On the other hand, you could also hear like music and stuff from the neighboring auditoriums, so that was kind of annoying. But it wasn't so bad that it ruined the movie experience. With all that said and out of the way, let's talk about what I thought about the movie, and let's start with recapping kind of what I talked about in my pre-show video and see how it measured up to my hopes, expectations, and fears. So in my pre-show video, which I'll link to in the description below in case you want to refresh your memory or didn't see it already, the expectations that I laid out were that they would cover a good bit of World War I, his relationships with the Tea Club and Barovian Society, or TCBS, his relationship with Edith Bratt, and that they would cover a lot of connections between his life and his fictional work, particularly Lord of the Rings, Hobbit, Silmarillion. And my expectations were pretty much met. That the trailers that came out pretty well gave the idea that that's what they were going to be covering, and that is pretty much what they covered. In fact, you could almost subtitle this movie or retitle the movie Tolkien, the TCBS, and Edith. And you could almost just title it Tolkien and the TCBS because almost all of the action revolves around his connections with the TCBS. And the story is very much told with them as the focus, and in particular, GB or Jeffrey Smith, who is one of the members of the TCBS. He does have a lot of the relationship with Edith in this movie, but even there, she's almost kind of an ancillary, or she's brought in almost as a part of the TCBS story rather than an independent thing unto herself. Not exactly, but she certainly seems to be a little bit less important than the TCBS. But at any rate, that being the case, that focus of the movie is very obvious. The TCBS and Edith are the two primary things. Interestingly enough, as far as World War I goes, the story isn't told purely chronologically. He's actually in World War I when the movie starts, and most of the rest of the movie is in flashbacks, except at the end we get a little bit of post-World War I stuff. So the World War I almost serves as a frame tale with him kind of remembering things. His experience in World War I is really limited to like 1 or 2 days when he's already got trench fever, and he's trying to get in touch with GB Smith to try to find out if he's still alive. As far as the other stuff, the Middle-earth connections, that is definitely treated, and I will get into that more when I talk about some of my hopes and fears. So as far as my hopes, the main thing that I was hoping for was that they were going to treat him as a fully complex individual, which they did pretty well. Because of the limited time span that the movie covered, there wasn't as much they could go into, but they did cover the more serious side of his nature and some of the more prankish side of his nature. They did a pretty good job with that. I was hoping that they would not overemphasize the connections with Middle-earth, and I think they did a pretty good job of that too. I mean, most of the references to his Middle-earth mythology were either done kind of as there are instances where he is inspired by certain things, and you can see where that's leading toward his mythology if you're familiar with it, or it's some of the stuff that we see in the trailers, for instance, like we see a cloud of smoke in World War I look kind of like a Balrog. that's actually during the period that he has trench fever, and so there's a bit of you could see a lot of that as hallucinations. Another instance of that is there's actually a point where German flamethrower units come up and start using their flamethrowers, and he kind of sees it as a dragon at first. So you can see these as hallucinations, and in that sense, it's very artfully done. So a lot of the Middle Earth connections fall into one of those two categories. I was hoping for a basically accurate chronology of his interests and work. And again, because of the very limited scope of what the movie was doing, this wasn't really much of an issue at all. It ends, spoiler alert, I guess, with him starting to write "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." And beyond that, we don't really see him doing a whole lot of specific development of anything in Middle Earth. We get references to the fact that he's writing stories. He mentions at one point to somebody that he invented a language for the fairies, which is what he was calling elves in the very early stages of his Silmarillion writing. But they, by and large, don't touch directly on what he was doing at any given time. And so the chronology is mostly just his life. It doesn't really touch mainly on the chronology of how he did his work. But they do touch on his love for language. In fact, his love for the sounds of language does come up a couple of times, which is a very important aspect of how he developed his languages and that sort of thing. So I think they did a good job with that. His time at Oxford is mainly limited to his first term or two before World War I starts, and then at the end we get him in, as an Oxford professor. So they don't really cover a lot of that, and that his academic career just isn't covered much because of the time limitation of the movie. So again, that's not really much of an issue. The one thing I will say that they didn't do all that well is cover the faith aspect of Tolkien's life. Tolkien's Catholic faith was a very, very important part of his life, and that was, I think, given short shrift in the movie. It is kind of referenced, but only obliquely. There are basically two scenes where you get any reference to him being connected with the Catholic Church in any way. Very early in the movie, we have his mom mentioning that they're lucky to have the church kind of taking care of them, which is not quite an accurate statement, really. It was just Francis Morgan, the one particular priest who ended up being his guardian after his mother passed, that was the main conduit of generosity that kind of kept the Tolkiens afloat. And so there's really a vague reference there. And then later on in the story, we get Francis Morgan telling Tolkien, stop seeing Edith Bratt, which really happens in his life. And he says this and then follows it up with, she's not even Catholic, implying, of course, that Tolkien is, but it's never explicitly stated. And of course, at this point in the story, Tolkien's kind of upset at Francis Morgan for trying to break off the relationship. And so because of that, you can almost read this as Tolkien thinking that Morgan is just an old fuddy-duddy and he doesn't care. And in fact, that tension of Edith being Protestant, whereas Tolkien is Catholic, is never really mentioned or resolved again in the movie. So it's not clear what happens with that. Whereas in the biography, it's made clear that Edith does actually convert to Catholicism and does actually they get married in the Catholic Church. And so that's just kind of left hanging out there. Those are the only two references to Tolkien's faith. You never really see him set foot in a church. You don't get any other mentions or references to it otherwise. So it is very weakly referenced. And I think that was, given the fact that they're focusing mainly on the TCBS, it's not quite so bad. But I still wish they wouldn't have almost given it a negative connotation with the confrontation with Francis Morgan. The other hopes that I had, which really don't come into play because of the timeline set in the movie, was his time with Lewis and the Inklings, because that never really becomes an issue because of the point at which they stop the chronology of the movie. So that's not really an issue. Some of the fears that I had would be that they would overblow the Middle-earth stuff. I've already kind of talked about that. They did do a pretty good job overall. There was one or two points maybe in the movie where I thought that the allusions were a little bit too much, and that's mainly, again, in the World War I scenes where you've got in particular, right before he kind of fades out and we next find him in a hospital, we've got him apparently confronting either Morgoth or Sauron as a cloud, and then a whole bunch of other clouds coming, which might be the Nazgul, and then he faints. But I mean, that one was one of the most over the top, and then there's one or two others maybe that were just a little too much. But again, given that he's experiencing trench fever and hallucinating, and he's already got these stories in his head and whatnot, you can understand why they did it. I just think those were the ones that went less subtle than they probably should have. Connected, of course, with that is my fear that they were going to overdo the World War I stuff. And there's a sense in which you might say that they overdid the World War I stuff because it tends to act like that's the main thing behind his mythology because of all the references you get in those scenes. But the movie does make clear that he was already working on these stories before he became a soldier in World War I. So I don't think that's really as much of a problem. And because the movie is more or less told in the frame tale of him remembering things from during the World War I scenes, it's really not that bad, and they're not very long or drawn out. There's not a whole lot there, but it does show enough to give you some good visual representations of things that might have influenced him, and I'll come back to that later as well. Of course, his love of language, which I was afraid that they would kind of leave out, they do get into, as I mentioned earlier, so that was good. The other two things that I was kind of afraid of would be that they would really short shrift his relationship with his mother and Frances Morgan. Frances Morgan doesn't spend a lot of time in this movie, but I think to the extent that they get him in this movie, his relationship with Tolkien and his character are covered pretty well. His relationship with his mother is very briefly touched on because she dies very early in the movie. And to the extent that they cover her at all, it's like she's the one who inspires his love of stories and not much else. Whereas the idea I get from Humphrey Carpenter's biography is that she, through her teaching him languages, instilled in him his love of language, and the stories kind of came later. So I think they could have handled his relationship with his mother better, and I think there probably should have been a little bit more of that. She does get referred to again later on, and the circumstances of her death as being kind of a factor in his life, but not necessarily in a way that I think is necessarily accurate. I mean, it seems more of a driving force of him wanting to not be poor because if he'd had money, he could have saved his mother. Whereas if you read Tolkien's letters and things of that nature, you really get the idea that the most profound impact it had on him was he saw her as kind of a martyr who died to make sure that they remained Catholic because she was basically abandoned by most of their Protestant family after she converted. So again, that's coming back to the faith thing. That's another one where they kind of avoid the faith issue and they really kind of cut her too short and changed her role in his life a little bit. And like I said, I'm not sure that she never inspired him as far as storytelling, but to me, that's not the primary thing. So that's just one of those issues where I think they could have done better. And my other fear was Tolkien's personality. I mean, were they going to make him too perfect, too broody? Because there certainly was a depressive aspect to his life. I think they did a good job. As I mentioned earlier, they did a fairly good job of capturing the different facets of his nature, his prankish side, his serious side. So I think they did a pretty good job of avoiding that. Now that I've covered all these things that I mentioned in my previous video, let me talk a little bit about some of the details of the movie. I'll make sure to warn of any spoilers, and I've already talked about some of this, but I'll refer back to it. But this is where I want to talk about what I liked and didn't like about the movie. So as I mentioned earlier, the time span of the movie is really mostly about his period with the TCBS in his last few years of studying at King Edward's School before entering Oxford, and then through his time with World War I. And then we get a very brief period of him later with kids and just starting The Hobbit. With that in mind, and with the Great War as a frame tale sort of aspect, we get a largely accurate in the broad strokes, but not entirely accurate in the details story. One of the things that I think was interesting about this was the creative licenses that were taken with the detailed aspects of the story, but the way in which they painted an overall broad, accurate picture. They do briefly reference that he was born in South Africa, but I mean, by the time this movie starts, he's basically at the age where his mother died. I mean, you get the impression only a few short months pass between the beginning of the movie chronologically and his mother passing, and then the next thing you know, they're in a boarding house, and he meets Edith. He's getting into school and meeting the TCBS, and that's one area where, again, this is a minor spoiler. Most of the spoilers I'm going to give, by the way, are not that major. They're not really anything terribly significant, but I will warn just in case. One of the first things that I noticed that was definitely not accurate was you get the impression that Tolkien is the last addition to the TCBS group, Tea Club and Barovian Society. That's not really true. In fact, I may be getting this wrong, but I think it was Gilson who ended up being the last member to join. Gilson is the son of the headmaster of the school, and the way he meets Tolkien, that kind of leads to him being included with the group that then becomes the TCBS, but in fact, it goes a little bit the other way around in real life. So you get stuff like that, but most of these changes are made for the purposes of keeping the drama in the story, and they aren't so radical that they really change your view of who Tolkien is. So I think by and large they did a good job with that. One of the nice things that I think they did was manage to tell a lot of the story through visuals and things like that. Like you get, he starts out, of course, living in the Sarehole Mill area, which is kind of where he got a lot of his love for the English countryside and his kind of hatred for the industrial aspects of England from his move to Birmingham. And they really play that up well, because when his mother says we have to move to Birmingham, he's very upset about this. And then when they do move to Birmingham, you get this really dingy view of an early industrial English town, which is not very inviting looking at all. And so visually, they do a really good job of telling that. Similarly, on the same note, they do a good job of kind of visually giving you some ideas of things that he might have taken inspiration from. For instance, when they show the battlefield of the Battle of the Somme in World War I, which is where he spends his time in the World War I scenes, he's got he kind of comes up over the edge of one of the trenches and sees all these pits in the ground. And the first thing I thought of was the Battle of Fingolfin with Morgoth from the Silmarillion, because it really visually struck me that way. Mainly because in the Battle of Fingolfin and Morgoth, it actually is described that Morgoth, in trying to hit Fingolfin, who keeps dodging Morgoth with his hammer, creates a bunch of pits in the ground, which eventually Fingolfin falls into and dies. So that imagery, I don't know if this was intentional on the director's part in this movie, but the imagery definitely made that connection in my mind. So that was interesting. Another thing that I thought was nice was some of the small touches they put in. So, for example, Tolkien in one scene refers to Edith as Little One. That was his pet name for her in real life. So that's a nice little touch. They just bring in a lot of really small things that really bring aspects of Tolkien's life in there without being really ham-fisted or heavy-handed about it. Similarly, one of the TCBS members, I forget which one now, refers to Tolkien as Tollers. And I know Lewis referred to him as Tollers. I'm not sure if anybody else actually did, so I'm not sure if that's accurate, but regardless, it is kind of an interesting touch. The one thing I will say that I was not super keen on with the TCBS, at one point there's a scene, here we go with a little bit of minor spoilers, so skip this part if you don't want to hear it, but Tolkien actually takes Edith to one of the meetings of the TCBS, and when she starts talking about her passion for music, Christopher Wiseman, who is the musically inclined of the group, starts having a conversation and starts to seem interested in her, and this annoys Tolkien. Later, they have Tolkien and Edith had a not exactly an argument, but Edith was kind of upset, basically making the point, I don't have a life outside of this boarding house. I basically play piano for the landlady, and that's kind of all I get to do. and you have, these outside groups that you can go to and things. I don't get to pursue my passions. And that does kind of reflect on Tolkien and Edith's relationship during their married years. And so that's kind of, I understand why they did it, but the tension with the TCBS, with Christopher Wiseman seemingly being interested in pursuing Edith in that one little scene, or at least that's how Tolkien perceives it, I thought that was a little bit much. And then there's another scene later on, again, spoilers if you don't want to catch this part, where the TCBS are meeting in essentially a bus that's just been left on a street in Oxford, which is kind of hinting at a part of Tolkien's life where he actually did like kind of steal a bus and do some shenanigans with it. He doesn't actually steal the bus here. Here they just walk onto it with the ladies they're with for the evening, and then that whole subject gets brought up again. This is after Francis Morgan has told Tolkien to drop Edith and focus on his studies. Tolkien is now in Oxford. He's still not 21, which is basically the age at which he can resume his relationship with Edith, because Francis Morgan no longer has any real say because he won't be his guardian anymore. But at this point, Tolkien is still sad about not having Edith. And I will say, just as a note here, it is nice that they kind of threw in a couple of glimpses of a letter addressed to Edith that's been sitting on Tolkien's desk or whatever throughout this period that he's waiting to send to her whenever he finally can. So it does show that he never gave up on it, which is true. But anyway, in this scene in the bus, Christopher Wiseman brings up this whole idea that he gave up Edith for Oxford, and so, he doesn't really have any business moping about it, and that creates a bit of a fight. Tolkien ends up kind of punching Wiseman, and to me, that was just a little bit overdone. To my knowledge, that never happened, or anything like that ever happened, so I don't, like I said, my only reference is Humphrey Carpenter's biography, so maybe something happened like that, but I don't know of it. So, but anyway, it just seemed a little bit overdone for the purposes of the movie. Finally, just on an objective level, I think the acting was well done. I think the cinematography generally was well done. I'm not really much of an expert for cinematography, but I think by and large the camera angles were done pretty well, and the way that they cut from different scenes to other scenes, I think, was done pretty well in terms of kind of giving you an impression of Tolkien's either imagination or just capturing the idea of magic in general in his storytelling, that sort of thing. I think that worked pretty well. Um, and like I said, the acting was good. Nobody was a super standout actor, I don't think, but everybody did a good job. Oddly enough, I will say, just in terms of who played who, Nicholas Hoult as Tolkien is a bit of a odd choice in that Holt is actually fairly tall, whereas Tolkien was slightly below average height. And weirdly, the I don't remember the actor's name, but there's two ages at which you see Tolkien. In the younger version, which is not Nicholas Hoult, he actually looks more like J.R.R. Tolkien, I think, in his younger days than Holt does as an adult. So that was kind of an interesting juxtaposition. So, but objectively, it was a well done movie, I think, very artfully done. And when I say artfully, I mean that in both the sense of it was well carried out and it was artistically very good. So the artistry of cinematography, I think, was good, but also the way that they handled different subjects was done with appropriate levels of subtlety, nuance for the most part, other than, like I said, a few things that I thought were just a little over the top. That being said, let me wrap up with some final thoughts of what I thought about the movie. So, did I like this movie? Yes. There are a few complaints that I have, which I've noted, but overall, I think the movie was very well done, and though the accuracy level is pretty low in the fine details, the broad strokes and the overall picture is actually pretty darn good. Um, the way I would characterize it is, if this is a portrait of Tolkien for his basically academic career as a student and his early, life in the military and whatnot, I would say that it's not a photograph, but it is a very well done impressionist painting of Tolkien as a person. So you're not going to get sharp details that are absolutely accurate to the man Tolkien was or the life that he lived, But by and large, everything they put in there either points to something that is accurate or is at least basically accurate in the idea that it gets across. And so, in the same way that an impressionist painting can kind of conjure emotions or, do things that necessarily a finely detailed painting may not do, or a photograph may not do, it captures the spirit of the thing very well, even though if you're looking for precise details, you may not find them, or if you do, they won't really be true to the subject matter. So I think overall, the movie, in that sense, is very much like Tolkien's stories in the way that he perceived stories. It conveys truth, but it's not factual. So, in that sense, it's a very appropriate way of handling a biopic of Tolkien himself, because Tolkien, as a storyteller, understood that the stories we tell are true in the different sense than history is true. That being said, you do have to understand going into this that a lot of the elements in the movie are either fictional or at least not 100% historically accurate. You have to recognize that what you're looking for is not, the actual events to be one-to-one parallel with what Tolkien actually lived through, but you do get a lot of sense of who the man was and what his background was like, and a lot of that is accurate. Some of the things may glide over your head if you're not really familiar with a lot of Tolkien's ideas or his thoughts about his own history. For example, the move from Sarehole Mill to Birmingham. Certainly the idea comes across that Sarehole Mill is kind of idyllic, very Shire-like, a countryside, whereas Birmingham is a dingy, sort of late industrial period, dirty town. And if you know Tolkien well enough, you're going to pick up on the idea that that might have been an inspiration for some of his works. But some of these things, if you're not that familiar with them, if all you've ever seen is just the Peter Jackson movies or something like that, some of those may glide over your head. And so, oddly enough, it's actually better to watch if you kind of know Tolkien's biography already in some ways. And perhaps that was kind of the goal was, we're going to put these ideas out there about who Tolkien was, and maybe that will give people an incentive to actually read his biographies. And I know John Garth, who has written more than one biographical work regarding Tolkien, has been posting a lot of stuff on Twitter about how the movie is not completely accurate. Here, check out my book. And I have not read John Garth's books, by the way. I'm just pointing this out because I've noticed it, and I found it rather interesting. But by and large, I think this idea of it being a true biography, what most people are pointing out online and what I think is true is that it's not truly a biography in the sense of being a documentary. It is a sort of fictionalized account, but it does a pretty good job. Like I said, not a photograph, more of an impressionist painting. So if that's the kind of thing that you're looking for in a biopic, which frankly most biopics are probably like that anyway, then you should enjoy this movie. And frankly, if you're just curious about Tolkien generally, then you should enjoy this movie. It's an engaging movie. It does, a pretty good job of telling a story without it being overly, weighing you down with details that you don't really need to know. It does give you a broad idea of who Tolkien was. So, as a final note, I'll just say that if I had to rate the movie, I would give it a solid 8 out of 10. And the main reasons I dock it are the short shrift they give to his mother and his Catholic faith, and the fact that the accuracy level is probably lower than it could have been and still made for an engaging story. So that's my review of the Tolkien biopic. So hope you enjoyed that video. Hope it gave you a good idea what to expect if you still haven't seen the movie. If you have seen the movie by now, then please do comment, share your thoughts. Obviously, I haven't touched on every detail of the movie. That would take way too long, and I just wanted to give a pretty good overview of what I thought about it. So if you have any particular things that you think should have been mentioned, please do leave those in the comments. Share this video with anybody else who might be interested in seeing the Tolkien bio and, not quite decided. This might help give them a good idea. You can follow me on Twitter for more stuff at JRRTLore. You can support the channel in the Patreon link in the description below. And you can also, of course, subscribe to the channel here. and you can find a couple of my previous videos here. Until next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.